Are people being introduced? I'll introduce myself. The next speaker will be Phil Rogaway from the University of California at Davis. Please, Phil. Thanks for that generous introduction. So, so I have a kind of long talk, so I want to make sure that I don't lose too much time. But you all look so far away. Do you think you could humor me by, like, coming up? Yeah, I would. Thank you. So,
up here?
As you like. So a lot of people seem to think that cryptography is really this amazing apparatus. I sense even in cryptographic discourse these days a kind of utopian vision that if we just mangle bits in the right way, then heaven on earth will be here, or something like this. And I'm often the beneficiary of this, I think, because, when I identify myself as a cryptographer, then I get a kind of stature from this that maybe isn't particularly deserved. And what's odd in some ways is that this stature is mirrored in both academia and in popular culture, which is kind of unheard of that they agree on anything. But in academia, cryptography is definitely a well-loved academic discipline. Fully 10 of 63 Turing Award winners are cryptographers. This is amazing because, it's not just that, cryptographers don't comprise 16% of academic researchers in computer science. Cryptographers don't comprise 1% of academic researchers in computer science. So this is way out of proportion. And then, in depictions of cryptography in film and in books, well, I can't complain. I don't know. Cryptographers are the brilliant and handsome mathematicians that the country needs to have working on its side. Power has to have in its corner. It can get a little bit silly on YouTube. A few weeks ago, this fellow here was explaining how to memorize like anything by creating what he called a memory palace, and he demonstrated how to remember 100 digits of pi using his contrivance. And someone, rings in the online comments, oh, this won't work for, memorizing tens of thousands of digits. But someone else, Gallican Sniper here says, hey, no, man, with cryptography, it's totally possible. So, yeah, I have to disappoint Gallican Sniper and tell you that cryptography will not improve your memory in any manner whatsoever. So I think that there's, lots of claims about what cryptography can do that clearly are, within the realm of its capacities. And there are lots of claims about what cryptography can do that are clearly outside the realm of its capacity. But there's also a fairly large gray space where I think there's this contested territory of whether cryptography is somehow up to the task. And the problem I'm really interested in, and have been interested in for a few years in this contested space, is whether cryptography can actually be a democratizing kind of technology, whether, in particular, cryptography holds potential for staving off authoritarianism. And I think my interests in authoritarianism should be kind of obvious. So I don't think we have to look hard to find the signs of emerging authoritarianism in contemporary society. And if you don't buy this political narrative, I won't convince you in the next minute anyway. But I think the signs are ostensible. And I should make clear that the rise of authoritarianism in U.S. political culture doesn't begin with Donald Trump. One can find the roots for this going back several years now. And many would say that the political power of the new wave of authoritarianism is a consequence of of what's called the Southern strategy, this idea in the late 1960s that the Republican Party would court white Southern voters by kind of playing in exactly to the tenets that ring strongly true for those with authoritarian tendencies. So I've been brandishing this word authoritarianism around for a bit without actually specifying what I mean. So authoritarianism is this worldview rooted in personality, rooted in human psychology, that values order and authority, and additionally distrusts outsiders and social change. And among its tenets are this loyal acceptance of authority, a willingness to accept established hierarchies, a strong aversion to ambiguity, a clear desire for answers. The pairing of these comprise what psychologists sometimes call a need for cognitive closure, a desire for traditionalism, strong notions of group, who is in my group and who is outside this group. Perhaps strangely, a tendency towards feelings of disgust, which maybe don't seem natural, but empirically are linked to the rest of these categories, as nicely demonstrated in a PLLS article a few years ago. Fear. Fear seems to be a hallmark of authoritarianism, and in fact, modern theories of authoritarianism suggest that non-authoritarians will in fact act like authoritarians when pushed, especially by external fears, by fears of someone they recognize as an outsider. High confidence in one's beliefs, that is a kind of closed-mindedness, and finally a tendency to ascribe a single cause to complex problems. So, I might comment that while authoritarianism is quite a loaded term, it's impossible to say this word without people saying, like, that's not me. Psychologists who study this, well, they failed to find an alternative word, but they try not to view this as in a kind of pejorative manner. This is simply a cluster of personality characteristics to many who work in this field. Authoritarianism got off to a really rocky start in the academic literature. It really begins just before World War II with the psychologist Erich Fromm trying to explain his understanding of the groundwork for authoritarianism, and continues just after the war in 1950 with a famous book by Adorno and others called The Authoritarian Personality. But as I was saying, the field kind of existed in a kind of intellectual no man's land, not really getting a decent reputation in academia, in part because of fundamental problems in instrumentation, in trying to measure authoritarianism. And the instruments that originally had been used would ask political questions and then try and say, look, it's correlated with these kind of political views and outcomes. And that didn't really make sense. So finally, in the early 1990s, and then popularized in a paper by Feldman and Stenner, a way of assessing authoritarianism was found that severed it from its political context, and the clever idea was to use simple questions about child rearing as a kind of surrogate to understand authoritarianism. And, why don't you take the test for yourself? So you can scribble it down or mentally scribble it. Which is more important for a child to have? A, independence. B, respect for elders. Which is more important for a child to have? A, obedience. B, self-reliance. Which is more important for a child to have? A, curiosity. B, good manners. All of these responses are alphabetical, so don't try and outwit it. Which is more important for a child to be? A, considerate, or B, well-behaved? All right. So to score this test, give yourself a quarter point for each of the indicated answers, B, A, B, B. So you'll have a score now of 0 to 1, and if your score is 3/4 or 1, congratulations, you're an authoritarian. If it's 0 or 1/4, you're a non-authoritarian. If you're a half, I guess you're right there in the middle. And this instrument, perhaps surprisingly, has been shown to bear a remarkable correlation with much longer instruments that tried to assess much more directly the property that had been called RWA, right-wing authoritarianism. And it turns out to be a wonderful predictor for support for Donald Trump. In fact, it is the best predictor for support for Donald Trump that's been found, apart from supporting Donald Trump. And this is an example from December 2015. There were at this time lots of candidates in the Republican primaries, and it shows as a function of the score on that test I just gave you whether callers favored Trump or somebody else. This is limited to white Republican voters in the primaries. The instrument I gave, incidentally, doesn't seem to be a good indicator of authoritarianism for blacks. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. My own interest in the relationship between authoritarianism and cryptography actually began well before Trump entered the political stage. It occurred with the Snowden revelations in the summer of 2013. So, following that exciting summer of Snowden, as I like to think of it, lots of commentators spoke of the threat to individual privacy, which was suggested by the revelations. My own concern was always something a little bit different. I was interested in the threat to democracy as posed by the existence of programs for mass surveillance. And certainly I wasn't the only one. Snowden himself, in one of the two interviews with Laura Poitras just after the revelations, said, eventually there will be a time where policies will change, because the only thing that restricts the activities of the surveillance state are policy. And because of that, a new leader will be elected, they'll flip a switch, and there will be nothing the people can do at that point to oppose it, and it'll be turnkey tyranny. Just after the Snowden revelations, in an interview with a German newspaper, Jimmy Carter said simply, America does not have a functioning democracy at this point in time. Now, it certainly wasn't, Snowden and other commentators at the time that were early to suggest that maybe cryptography could help out in addressing this problem. The speakers who addressed this problem most eloquently and early were really the cypherpunks. The cypherpunks, remember, emerged in the early 1990s, unified by this mailing list and a kind of set of shared sensibilities concerning the threats to democracy and human autonomy posed by changes in technology. And as an example of the kind of discourse from the cypherpunks in this direction, I might read this little piece from the Crypto Anarchists Manifesto by Tim May. Tim May is one of the founding cypherpunks. He writes, "A specter is haunting the modern world, the specter of crypto anarchy. Cryptologic methods fundamentally alter the nature of corporations and government, alter the nature of corporations and government interference in economic transaction. Combined with emerging information markets, crypto anarchy will create a liquid market for any and all material which can be put into words and pictures. And just as barbed wire made possible the fencing off of vast ranches and farms, so too will cryptography come to be the wire clippers which dismantle the barbed wire around intellectual property. Arise, you have nothing to lose but your barbed wire fences." This kind of very optimistic discourse among the cypherpunks continued throughout the 90s and really continued until the present day, though the cypherpunk movement, I suppose, has morphed quite a bit since then. Here's Edward Snowden speaking again, actually in the run-up to his disclosures in email to Glenn Greenwald. "In words from history, let us speak no more of faith in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of cryptography." Really expressing, I think, quite perfectly this kind of cypherpunk ethos. But from where does this kind of optimism that cryptography would save us from the encroachments of the state, where does this arise? Why, and is this optimism actually actually realistic? Well, one answer might be that this optimism is actually born of a kind of pessimism, that if you believe that data will invariably be read and exploited if it's not encrypted, then in some sense your only chance is to make sure that essentially everything is encrypted. And so maybe it's simply that. But I think there's more to it, that has lent weight to the optimistic position, with respect to the utility of cryptography. And I think if we disentangle it, the implicit mental model is effectively this, that technological change is creating the conditions which lead to a widespread increase in our surveillance capabilities. These particular technological conditions are, of course, a movement of more and more information flow into the digital realm, the ability to capture all of this information which is flowed or which is stored, and then the third piece, which has entered the stage only more recently, is our ability to actually analyze these mountains of information in order to glean some actionable content. If you believe that technology induces all of these improved capabilities and you look out upon our political history, you probably will come to the conclusion that these capabilities will almost certainly be exploited in order to expand surveillance. This expansion of surveillance both benefits authoritarian leaders, and then they, in turn, push for further expansions in surveillance and surveillance capabilities. If this is the roadmap, then how is cryptography going to somehow come to interfere with it? Well, the most obvious manner is that cryptography will create a kind of alternative technological landscape in which the crypto actually obstructs our surveillance capabilities. It will obstruct it by ensuring that he who gathers information will gather nothing of any utility, nothing but meaningless bits. You might hope that he who gathers the information also gains no particularly informative metadata, that the information that's flowed doesn't speak to who is trying to communicate to whom. There is a second way in which cryptography might help to confront authoritarianism, and you might call this the, strong program of the cypherpunks. This was the possibility that crypto would create entirely new democratic possibilities. So domains like entirely electronic money were one of the early cypherpunk wishes, one that finally came into fruition in a practical way with Bitcoin, and one could certainly imagine that Bitcoin used pervasively is such a new anti-authoritarian capability. I think a more politically significant crypto-enabled technological change that the cypherpunks had wished for, and that finally did come on the stage, is improved capacities for whistleblowing, in particular websites like WikiLeaks. So how has this program worked out? Has crypto actually done much to obstruct surveillance capabilities, and has crypto led to entirely new liberties which counter authoritarian tendencies? And I think the answer to both of these is clearly no. That, in particular, crypto, were it to genuinely be obstructing surveillance capabilities, would be posing a risk to both capital and the state that it really wouldn't find tolerable. And we've never really had significant quantities of data being pulled out of the realm of surveillance. Well, perhaps until quite recently. I think you can say that the popularization of messaging protocols like WhatsApp actually has removed significant amounts of content, though nothing has touched the metadata story. As for the new liberties, well, there too, I think the situation is disappointing. If one was hoping that whistleblowing sites like WikiLeaks would lead to expanded democratic potential, I think the story is quite mixed as to whether, in the end, the tendency is one that is favoring democratic movements or one that's actually oppositional to it. I think another explanation for the optimism surrounding cryptography's capacity to improve democracy is based simply on the architecture of encryption. So encryption, whether it's in the symmetric setting or in the public key setting, has a bunch of things going for it which seem to promote democratic tendencies. Those things would include, well, first, the basic mathematics of hard functions, that we really believe it's possible to create these super polynomial, even exponential differences in the amount of effort that's needed to encrypt and to decrypt under an unknown key. Furthermore, cryptography, unlike something like, nuclear power, doesn't require anything exotic. It's easy to set up. It's cheap. No exotic materials or costly resources needed. It's actually quite difficult to regulate. He who has the ability to program and a general-purpose computer probably has the ability to get some sort of encryption going. Even the nomenclature surrounding encryption seems to embody this kind of everyman ethos. The parties that are encrypting are the Alices and Bobs of the world. They're the kind of everyone characters. And yet I think you can counter all of these arguments. First, the uses of encryption are certainly varied. And if you're using encryption not to send a private message to your buddy, but to ensure that, the Netflix content isn't used for some purpose other than you yourself viewing that movie, well, you haven't actually done anything to empower the end user. You've actually done something to further empower the service provider. We can say, sure, math is embodied. We can say, sure, the mathematics somehow sounds like it's favoring the defender, but once the math is actually embodied in some actual system, that math isn't what you're going to attack. The locus of attack moves to the embodied system, and there, well, offense seems to have the advantage over defense. Encryption can, in fact, be regulated, and it doesn't have to be perfectly regulated to be effectively regulated. The U.S. government's program of regulating the export of encryption was actually highly effective for accomplishing the task which it actually aimed to do, which was to ensure that the volume of encrypted traffic remained low. Even the claim that, well, anyone can do this, you just need the ability to program in a general-purpose computer, this too is subject to contention these days. It seems that we've been slowly drifting away from general-purpose computation, and more computing is embodied in special-purpose appliances. Finally, I would comment that crypto is not encryption. Crypto is a much broader set of topics, and just because symmetric or public key encryption might in the end somehow favor democratic institutions, that doesn't mean crypto as a whole has any such tendency. And in fact, even if you step away from the conventional setting of encryption and just move to a slightly neighboring one, it seems that the tendencies are already radically different. So here's a picture showing what's called identity-based encryption, IBE, suggested by Shamir and first realized by Bonet and Franklin in a desirable manner. And, in identity-based encryption, everybody can send you a message by using your email address, let's say, as your public key. And this is always the advertised advantage of identity-based encryption, that it minimizes the key distribution problem by ensuring that something that you already have is the public information that's needed for you. But this, this version of the story omits something really crucial, which is the only way that you get your public key to be your email address is that some authority, the public key generator, it's usually called in the IBE literature, has issued you your secret key. Identity-based encryption is a form of key escrow. In fact, it's a particularly problematic form of key escrow because this public key generator knows everybody's secret key. It knows everybody's secret key that has been issued and that will ever be issued. Looked at in this manner, this flavor of IBE doesn't seem to have democratizing tendencies at all. It would seem to favor very much the power that's embedded in the PKG. And furthermore, even if you think that your PKG is good, well, the PKG itself becomes a ripe target for subversion. This one secret key that unlocks all others. Sometimes I think the tendencies within a cryptographic setting are really not at all obvious. So what I've drawn here now is the flow diagram depicting fully homomorphic encryption, FHE. The idea here is that I'm going to somehow overcome the tyranny of cloud computing by sticking only encrypted data in the cloud. And furthermore, I'm going to be the one who owns the decryption key. Okay, so what could go wrong here? When I want the cloud to do some computation on my data, I'll send it the function f I hope to be computed. I can actually obscure this thing too if I really want to somehow encrypt f as well. And the cloud, by the magic of FHE, is going to send me back the encryption of f applied to the message m. What could be more wonderful? The cloud doesn't understand the message m that it's storing, nor does it understand f of m, the content that it's just created for me, and yet, as though by magic, it manages to produce the encryption of f of m, which I can happily decrypt using my decryption key. As I said, this sounds wonderful, this sounds idyllic. From the point of view of who has what power, we are disempowering the cloud. But I think when you scratch just a little deeper, not all is as it appears. Most importantly, it really seems that FHE is unlikely in any foreseeable time frame to become a practical technology. On the other hand, we have many tens of the world's best cryptographers working on this technique. What we really do by promoting FHE and like highly theoretical technologies is to kind of bump up the prestige of what I call crypto for crypto. Cryptography that isn't actually intended for the real world and will probably never have any practical impact on the real world, but really does wonders for improving your career as a cryptographer. This creates a kind of large-scale diversion of resources, and it also kind of induces a sort of pseudo-pragmatism in which you'll see in grant proposals and in introductions to papers people touting the practicality of fully homomorphic encryption without really facing up to the fact that we're not likely to ever get there and that there are really very pressing privacy problems going on right now. As I indicated before, one of the things we could hope to be optimistic about is that cryptography can benefit privacy, or it could do other things, and that this balance is really up to us. In a nice short paper by Arvind Narayanan, he partitions cryptographic work into kind of two camps. He speaks of crypto for privacy, which is the kind of crypto that underlies Tor, for example, and crypto for security, which is the crypto that underlies something like SSL/TLS. Narayanan's conclusion is that crypto for security has really done well. Certainly it has done well enough that it supports billions of dollars of electronic commerce. Crypto for privacy, on the other hand, it's kind of been an abject failure. I think Tor is actually the thing that has succeeded most, and yet even it is achieving, a tiny amount of obfuscated web traffic. Furthermore, Narayanan's conception of cryptography as being crypto for privacy and crypto for security misses really important pieces of the puzzle. One is the one that I just mentioned, crypto for crypto. Most cryptographers really aren't doing work that fits into either of these two categories. If you pick up the proceedings to crypto, Eurocrypt, or AsiaCrypt and try your best to classify each paper as crypto for privacy, crypto for security, or crypto that's just really meant to get another paper published, I'm afraid they almost all fall into the last category, and the remainder are over here. Even then, we're not really done. what is it exactly that the NSA is doing with its billions of dollars in crypto spending? Well, it's kind of over here, crypto for power. This is the ideas, kind of nicely explained in the open literature in Young and Jung's work on kleptography, in which we can try and exploit cryptography itself in order to bolster existing power structures. You could say then that the extent to which cryptography really helps privacy is kind of the extent to which our resources and mental efforts fall within this rightmost category. And if you take this point of view, then you're probably not happy, because a drawing closer to scale, I fear, looks much more like this. Crypto for power seems to get by far the largest amount of capital expenditure. These two are actually rather hard to compare. The expenditures in companies are almost entirely here, and the expenditures in academia are almost entirely on the left. And crypto for privacy? Well, they have the PETS conference. There's very little that goes on there in truth. Still continuing in this explanation for why optimism might be realistic, I might point to the kind of discourse suggested by Lawrence Lessig in his code is law kind of trope. So he's not referring strictly to software here, but to the idea that how we architect our systems, the software, the hardware, the complete architecture of our computing systems defines that which we can do on them. It defines the realm of what's visible. It sets where we have the ability to regulate. And in this manner, it operates very much like the law, regulating in an analogous manner. Similar kinds of ideas were suggested in a short blog post by Mitch Kapor that many people know. This is, again, potentially quite useful. It just says if we were to get, the Internet's architecture right, we could make a very democratic system, the kind of system that many people imagined the Internet to have been. But it also says that we can get things very wrong, and that we will get things wrong if power is the one who determines the shape of this architecture. And I'm afraid that that very much is what has happened. When we say that we can architect the Internet, I'm afraid that the architecture of the Internet these days is mostly determined by, standardization committees and political processes which are dominated by fundamentally illiberal companies and governments. So if somehow one imagines, as if by magic, that the voices of civil society would percolate up and determine the most democratic architecture for our computing systems, I think this is naive. I believe another aspect of the support for crypto as a democratizing technology stems from the claim that lots of cryptographers are super smart and they'll save us. Again, this kind of echoes back to the depiction of cryptography in the films and books on the subject. But my own observation as a cryptographer is that, lots of cryptographers really are very smart, and they're very smart in the one thing that they work on. That there doesn't necessarily seem to be any spillover, that, cryptographers, any more than any other set of individuals, are particularly attuned to the political and social consequences of what they construct. And more broadly, I would say that technologists across the spectrum tend to be really quite tone deaf these days to the social consequences of the technological work that they do. Most work by most cryptographers really has nothing to do with privacy, as I've said before, and we should add to all of this the fact that the crypto community, in any case, is extremely tiny. I mentioned this at the very beginning. There are fewer than 1,000 people in the world who have published as many as 3 papers in an IACR-sponsored conference or workshop. 3 papers is a very low bar for what one would take to be considered a cryptographer. So we're looking at a field that is, an order of magnitude or more smaller than, fields like computer graphics or, natural language processing. And the truth is that most of my colleagues really could not care less about mass surveillance. This was true before Snowden published, and I really hope that Snowden would be kind of a sea change in setting our priorities. It hasn't worked out that way. Simply scanning all IACR conference proceedings, the thousands of pages for the word surveillance, will reveal that it didn't appear in any paper in the year 2011, nor 2012, nor 2013, and I can go back many other years before this. It first appeared finally in a 2014 paper of mine, and then it continued to appear at this kind of trickle of a rate by me and my colleagues. This has never particularly captured the interest of cryptographers, and sadly, the Snowden revelations didn't change this fundamental dynamic. Here's something that might have changed this dynamic, and that's who funds work in cryptography. Well, it's hard to get good numbers on this. I don't know how to determine total dollar expenditures to academia from the NSF versus DoD agencies like DARPA. But one thing I was able to do, actually a student was able to do it for me, was to go through all the old conference proceedings of IACR conferences, Eurocrypt, AsiaCrypt, Crypto, PKC, and TCC, and to simply identify among those papers which acknowledge extramural U.S. funding, what fraction of them acknowledge DoD funding. And you can see how it's risen. That prior to 2003 and before, there was very little DoD money being spent in cryptography. And by around 2007, 2008, this substantially picked up. Nowadays, almost all of my colleagues who support more than a couple of students get some DARPA money and often money from other DoD agencies as well. In fact, it can be kind of funny looking the acknowledgement section on grants, which will sometimes identify half a dozen or more different grants, some cocktail soup, mostly of DoD agencies. You might say, though, that, maybe my colleagues and me, maybe we're just not needed anyway. That cryptography can function perfectly well with the contributions of kind of amateurs and outsiders. And there's some reason to believe that this is actually so. Diffie and Hellman's 1976 paper had this kind of remarkable sentence: "Skill in production cryptanalysis has always, I think it should say relied heavily on the side of professionals, but innovation, particularly in the design of new types of cryptographic systems, has come primarily from amateurs." I think this is a depressing thought if you spent your life as an academic, that you thought you were somehow ahead of the amateurs. And I think there's actually a lot of evidence for Diffie and Hellman's claim. If I looked to the artifacts that seem to have mattered most in getting cryptography into the real world in recent decades, here are the ones that came to mind: PGP, Kerberos, Tor, TLS, Bitcoin, Signal, Secure Drop I really like. They have an interesting commonality. Not one of them involved any significant contribution from any academic cryptographer. Nowadays, TLS has been gathering lots of attention from lots of academics. It's come quite lately. Kerberos, you might imagine, had lots of academic support. It came out of MIT. I was actually at MIT at the time that Kerberos was being developed. I was in the cryptography group. Neither I nor any of my professors had ever heard of it. It was going on at a different floor. I think there's some reasons for optimism, even from the point of view of a curmudgeon like me. First of all, I would say that cryptographers actually do have the potential to act politically. When I got frustrated that the IACR board wouldn't, it seem, put out a statement somehow acknowledging Snowden and the existential threat to cryptography that in some sense was posed by pervasive surveillance. When the ICR didn't want to say this, I finally just went to a membership meeting among cryptographers and proposed that the membership adopt such a statement. The membership of the ICR repudiates mass surveillance and the undermining of cryptographic solutions and standards, and so on. And what I found, remarkably, was that in this context, cryptographers were more than happy to raise their hand and say yes. In fact, that resolution was unanimously passed in Copenhagen a couple of years ago. Along with Joan Feigenbaum and other colleagues, I also put together an open letter from cryptographers and some computer security professionals, and took a lot of work, but eventually we were able to get 50-odd well-known cryptographers and others to sign on to this letter, which made reasonably strong statements about mass surveillance and cryptography. One of the things I think that concerns me most about cryptography having an impact in this direction is the extent to which this problem has been successfully framed by power. And cryptographers, like most people in the United States and abroad, really seem to buy into this framing very strongly. Let me give the basic tenets of it. First of all, privacy is seen as a personal good. It's that which you need in order to somehow go about your business with a feeling of security. In contrast, security is viewed as a collective good. It's somehow what we all need in order to ensure that we can walk down the street without, an ISIS terrorist coming and slitting our throat. And that these two things, privacy and security, are inherently in conflict. As privacy benefits, security gets the short end of the rope, and vice versa. And furthermore, that this necessary conflict between privacy and security has now gotten quite out of whack. And it's gotten out of whack because of technology. That encryption in particular has disturbed the prior balance. Privacy is winning now, and we all run the risk of going dark. Somehow our world will turn into this dark place of dark closets, and because of this, the bad guys will win. And the bad guys are very bad. They're terrorists and child molesters and drug kingpins, and we just can't allow this to occur. This is the framing some people call the going dark framing, or the law enforcement framing, and it's nicely enunciated by James Comey, the FBI director. And the problem with this going dark framing is, well, kind of the whole thing is fiction, that it's all really bullshit. And that a much more realistic framing, what one might call the surveillance studies framing, or the golden age of surveillance framing, says that that's not at all the way our world is working. That surveillance is not some kind of tool for confronting terrorists, but it's an instrument of power. And that terrorism is little more than the cover for action, which we have found to be so useful, or that power has. And that technology is in fact changing this landscape, but it's not changing it by helping privacy at all. The technological changes are working to make surveillance much cheaper. In fact, they're making the incremental cost of surveilling just one more individual essentially zero. And at that kind of valuation, as long as it has potential value, it doesn't even have to have actual realized value, people do it. That surveillance is closely tied to cyber war and assassinations, and that it's not really possible to disentangle what we're doing as a society domestically with our intents for using surveillance internationally and in conflicts. The privacy and security are actually quite rarely in conflict. That by and large, privacy supports security, and that the two work together quite well. Furthermore, that a world in which surveillance has become routinized and ubiquitous, that we all suffer in very severe ways, that people become conforming, they become fearful, they become boring. And that surveillance stifles dissent, that we won't have any possibility for legitimate political action in a realm in which surveillance is effectively administered on population-wide scales. Finally, I would add that the costs of surveillance are not borne equally across society, that in poor communities, in communities of color, the costs for surveillance are already far higher than in rich white communities. In the prevailing framing of surveillance, surveillance is being used for two principal goods. Those goods are fighting terrorism and selling you lots of stuff. As long as we accept this framing, I think we're kind of in trouble. And I think it's not very accurate about what the real purposes of surveillance actually are. The ambitions are actually much greater. Even according to NSA documents themselves, terrorism is just one of their missions. They try to serve their customers, and what their customers most want to do is to know the future. And they want to know the future so that they can change the future. And this is exactly what corporations want to do as well. They want to be able to predict you, and they want to be able to gently nudge you in the directions that will be useful. Because if you can know the future, and if you can gently adjust that future, well, then first of all, you can make tons of money. But in addition, you have enormous power. You can win elections, you can stifle dissent, you can shape public opinion in the manner that you hope to be most in your interest. You achieve what Donna Haraway sometimes calls the God trick, this idea of being able to see everything and to shape that which you see as though a god from on above. Of course, in Haraway's view, the God trick is an illusion. We can't actually have such vision, and we certainly lack the wisdom with which to adjust behaviors that would be consistent with having such an all-encompassing view. The ability to make lots of money and have lots of power, I think, has always been attractive, but I think it has a special appeal these days because there are, in fact, major challenges facing the world. These challenges aren't actually coming from terrorism or something like that. That, I think, we all really know at some level is a cover story. But that there are real problems, and those real problems, I think, are mostly coming from environmental collapse, climate change, and other environmental threats. And they're coming from the ever-increasing wealth inequality problems. And these two things together will make a population eventually want to rebel. But you can't rebel if you're effectively surveilled and effectively adjusted. You know, in the week or so after the first Snowden revelations, I had the pleasure of going to the Turing Award ceremonies where my advisor, Silvio Macaulay, was getting the Turing Award. And Silvio is always wonderfully optimistic. He spoke at that event saying, computer science is marking an epochal change in human history. We are conquering a new and vast scientific continent. Virtually all areas of human activity and virtually all areas of human knowledge are benefiting from our conceptual and technical contributions. And, you know, it kind of bothered me, the entire event occurring while we were in the midst of seeing what, in fact, our technology was bringing forth on mankind, the ability to look into the minutiae of every individual's life and ultimately to be able to use this knowledge to shape those lives in desired directions. And I think the kind of over-the-top optimism, the technological optimism, which carries forward so many who work in technology, I think it's actually a dangerous trend. Because if you believe that no matter what we do as a society, the technology is going to somehow make it right, then you don't adequately direct that technology, and you get the kind of world that we're creating right now. I think a much more realistic assessment of where we are is this, that computer science really is marking epochal changes in human history. But many of these changes actually threaten human values, and even human existence. And that it's going to be very difficult for mankind to somehow get around this bump, and it will take a lot of work and wisdom and luck to survive these threats. I didn't have time to talk about all of the thoughts I had in connection with the interaction between cryptography and authoritarianism. I've put a kind of summary here, including lots of things I didn't get to discuss, and I'll just close out with that on the board. All right. I think I do have time for a few questions, if you like. Please.
So, like, how big of an impact is it now that ISPs can sell and collect our data and all that? Like, how is that going to play? Is that just moving more in that's probably just moving more in that direction, I guess?
So the question refers to the extent to which the recent congressional decision to overturn Obama-era privacy rules with respect to ISPs. I think it's just more of the same, that we've seen a steady erosion of privacy rights, and this one was quite expected. And yeah, I don't know. It's a problem. Please.
I was wondering what makes the encrypted storage
Storing things encrypted in the cloud is perfectly feasible. That's feasible today.
Sorry, that's not true.
But in fully homomorphic encryption, you don't just want to keep things encrypted in the cloud. You then want the cloud to do all your computation for you without understanding anything about that which it's computing. And that's asking for a lot technologically. We can achieve something close to it much more realistically using a concept called secure computation or multi-party computation. The model is a little bit different, but it achieves basically the same end of carrying out computations in a manner in which individual holders of data don't understand the nature of the computation that they're jointly accomplishing. Even then, and I would say that secure computation for lots of problems has become quite practical. Even then, I don't see us moving in directions in which secure computation, multi-party computation, is becoming more important or ubiquitous. And in part, I think the incentive structures are all wrong. One thing that, the cloud provider really wants to make sure it can do is know your data, because that's part of the model for its monetization. So, I'm not hopeful that even if we could flip a switch and somehow have the complexity problems solved, even then, I don't know that we would see a world in which computation in the clouds, private computation in the clouds, became ubiquitous. And I would guess I would also add that there's a kind of irony in all of this, because storage has become really cheap. And we don't need the cloud anymore for storing the kind of quantities of data that individual end users are wanting to store. Why are you all sticking your stuff in Gmail, in a Google-run cloud? You could, in principle, have this, working in the same manner as an answering machine in your home. You can back it up to your mom's answering machine. If it were a distributed, cheap appliance that provided your own local cloud, you'd get essentially all of the advantages of cloud storage, namely, a shared common view of the state and transparent backup, but without having given away the content itself to this provider, which represents a major shift in power, actually. I'll take maybe one more, and then I better leave room for the next speaker, please.
So if the encryption is successful to help those not powerful, let's say that it is successful, how contentious do you think shift in power can become?
The question is, if we really were able to shift power successfully to the weak, what would happen politically? And I think we would see major opposition. I think the moment one really was effective at keeping data from Facebook and Google, the moment one was truly effective at hiding metadata content associated to telephony, there'd be immediate and strong pushback in our political process. I better wrap up for then, but I'll be around if people would like to chat with me anymore. Thanks.